first discussion, which is aimed at thinking about these cross-cutting priorities collectively in a way to better set the scene for the deep dives that will follow in the sessions. And clearly, when we thought about this discussion with the Latvian colleagues on this kind of collective dimension, there was two main dimensions that came to mind on the common challenges and opportunities. And one was more related to the collectiveness and how policy coherence, and maybe more specifically policy coherence for development or policy coherence for sustainable development, were at the core of the very idea of transversal program mainstreaming. And for that discussion, we'll have the pleasure to welcome Ernesto Soria Morales, who is Senior Policy Analyst on Policy Coherence for Sustainable Development Division in the Public Governance Directorate. And the second dimension was the common framework, the results framework under which these cross-cutting priorities can exist in the Latvian development cooperation system, and the importance that these priorities, in a way, do not exist in an ad hoc manner from the system, that having clear objectives, targets, indicators, and measurement methods is crucial to that mainstreaming exercise. And here we'll have the chance to welcome Chantal Verger, our very own head of unit on results in the Development Cooperation Directorate. So thank you both for taking part in that discussion. And I will give Ernesto the floor for 10 to 12 minutes and then turn to Chantal. Again, thank you very much. And Ernesto, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sydney. Good morning, everyone. Let me share my screen. I have a presentation just to support what I'm gonna say. First of all, I'm very pleased to participate in this seminar and contribute to the discussions on mainstreaming cross-cutting priorities in development cooperation. In this short presentation, I'm going to talk about how policy coherence for sustainable development from the public governance perspective can support mainstreaming of cross-cutting priorities, such as the Sustainable Development Goals. And actually, we are using this approach through an instrument, through the OECD recommendation on policy coherence for sustainable development, to support member and partner countries in addressing the SDGs in an integrated manner. And I will focus on this, on some of the key methodological aspects, but also on the processes and institutional mechanisms. And in particular, some of the experiences that we have collected on OECD countries to enhance coherence and addressing the SDGs in an integrated manner. So let me start just by highlighting that in the context of the SDGs, policy coherence is essential to inform decision-making in addressing highly interconnected targets. As you know, the SDGs were not designed as isolated targets, but to be mutually supportive. And this means that taking action in one specific target, one specific sector or area within the SDGs will have some positive or some negative repercussions for other areas, goals, or targets. This figure, which comes from the 2019 Global Sustainable Development Report, shows the result of a world assessment of current knowledge about the interactions between the different sustainable development goals and targets. And this graph perfectly shows the kind of interactions that occur between the targets. And for example, the relative importance of the potential trade-offs, which are highlighted in orange in the graph, but also the dominance of positive interactions, which are highlighted in blue. So given the integrated nature of the sustainable development goals, we see policy coherence as an essential approach to capitalize on synergies among goals and targets. For example, as I try to highlight in that graph, using water efficiency under SDG or promoting water efficiency under SDG 6, of course, will depend on improving sustainability in agriculture, which is under other area. And usually this sector work in isolation, not necessarily in an integrated manner, as we've seen in several countries. And this connection is very important between the water use efficiency and sustainability in agriculture, because as you know, agriculture is the major user of water, which accounts for about 70% of world's freshwater withdrawals. So policy coherence in this context is also essential to anticipate and manage some trade-offs that necessarily are going to occur when implementing or when trying to achieve sustainable development. So, because this is essential, given that to achieve sustainable development, if not implemented in an integrated manner, different sectors might be competing for the same resources. And this necessarily will entail overlaps and fragmented actions to achieve sustainable development. For example, between efforts for ending hunger under goal 2 and efforts to increase the share of renewable energy by producing, for example, biofuels, if food crops and biofuel crops are competing for the same land and water resources. So, without consideration of these interactions, silo approaches can slow or even reverse progress on sustainable development. So at the OECD, we've been trying to unpack what it means policy coherence for sustainable in practice, and how to address the integrated nature of the SDGs. So, and as we know, public administrations are usually not organized to deal with this type of interactions. Governments sometimes have limited resources and need to prioritize actions among all this indivisible whole. And we know that governments now need to work differently to address these trade-offs and synergies and ensure effective implementation strategies. You know, the SDGs actually have this target 17.14, which is about enhancing policy coherence as a means of implementation for all the 17 goals. And at the OECD, we have defined this target or try to unpack, as mentioned, this target. And we see three main aims.
Un mēs redzam trīs galveno
to apply policy coherence. First of all, is about maximizing synergies and minimizing trade-offs, but also balancing domestic and international priorities, and address the transboundary and long-term effects of policies. From the policy coherence perspectives, we think that there are key aspects we should be present in order to integrate effectively or mainstream effectively sustainable development in policy and decision making. The integration of the, as you know, the core dimensions of sustainable development into policies, into practices, entails, first of all, identifying potential trade-offs in terms of how different sectors might be competing for the same resources, as I presented in the example, but also in terms of aligning between subnational, national, and global actions, and also in terms of short-term and long-term priorities. And the consideration of both short and long-term effects, what seems to be beneficial in the short term can be devastating in the long term, is very important in the context of sustainable development. Similarly, the consideration of impacts of policies on third countries, or most importantly, on developing countries. So, as you know, the consideration of these main aspects is not straightforward. And for this reason, at the OECD, we have developed this instrument to support members and partners identifying what are the essential mechanisms required in the system of policy making to ensure that sustainable development is integrated effectively, but at the same time to ensure that policies contribute to sustainable development in a coherent manner. And as you know, this recommendation is based on the premise that the ability to consistently develop and implement coherent policies for sustainable development depends on the processes, on the systems, on the structures and the capacities and tools used by the governments to manage these interactions and trade-offs and coordinate policy at different levels. In these 8 elements, the recommendation actually identifies 8 elements that need to be present and need to be, and actually we have identified all these elements present in all countries. These are very basic tools. The problem is that in many cases, these elements are not using proactively to mainstreaming or to enhance policy coherence. And we have seen a lot of practices. I don't want to go into too much detail, but just to highlight that for the system, of course, a precondition is a high political commitment. As you know, the priority accorded to sustainable development in the case of the SDGs, but also policy coherence in particular at the highest level is essential to mobilize governmental action at all levels. And as you know, sometimes integration is not only a technical undertaking, it requires a lot of negotiation. There are interests in between, and sometimes there is this is often the interest of finding the best political solution, not necessarily. But that's why the system requires, there is no one single tool to mainstream sustainable development. But what is required is a system that looks at the whole policy-making process for integrating the sustainable development. We have seen as mentioned, different practices in different countries. And of course, there is no one-size-fits-all solution for mainstreaming, for policy coherence. There are, but nevertheless, there are common elements that are present in countries with different political and administrative tradition. As I said, political commitment is the precondition. Then, of course, we've seen how countries are applying that political commitment when it comes to policy coherence and SDG integration and implementation. Of course, long-term vision is essential in the context of sustainable development to inform decision-making on what would be the implications for future generations in terms of the way we manage resources in the here and now, and how that will have implications elsewhere. Tools for policy integration, governments have a lot of tools available, including very essential tools such as the budget process or public procurement or evaluation policy or regulatory policy. And there are different practices, but what we have seen is sometimes sustainable development in regulatory policy is not well developed in different countries. So it requires strengthening some of the tools, existing tools, when it comes to use them more proactively for integrating sustainable development and achieving the SDGs in an integrated manner. An important aspect of coordination, of course, this is essential for integration or mainstreaming of sustainable development. But what is very important in coordination mechanisms that exist in all countries is specific mandates to resolve tensions and policy trade-offs, and a specific process that leads to solutions. And sometimes we've seen even in countries identified and have the data, the evidence of some of the tensions between the sectors, there is always a problem when it comes to decide on which takes priority or how to solve the tension. Of course, when it comes to integration, many of the actions to really advance sustainable development require subnational engagement, because many of the actions that will support achievement of sustainable development take place at that level of government. Maybe one important thing is also stakeholder engagement. As you know, many of the issues of incoherences stem from the different perceptions and interests between stakeholders. So there is a need for having mechanisms that help understand priorities, that help communicate some of the tensions and engage different actors in supporting sustainable development. And of course, very important, the capacities to analyze and anticipate policy impacts. We've seen in several countries different instruments. And the last point, but not less important, is a strengthening monitoring and reporting system to inform policy making, taking into consideration some of the negative impacts and change policy in the next cycle. So I'll, with this, just want to highlight 3 points. There is no one-size-fits-all approach to mainstreaming and to enhance policy coherence. These principles that I briefly outlined, as mentioned, they are relevant and applicable to most countries. And third, many countries have well-established mechanisms that can support mainstreaming and coherent implementation of sustainable development. But these mechanisms are not used proactively, so there is a room for improvement there. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to respond any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Ernesto, and thank you for this introduction. And of course, the council recommendation is also valid for our Latvian colleagues, and we've seen in some of your charts that Latvia was performing quite well in some areas. So that's already good stuff. But I think it was a really good reminder of kind of the interconnectedness of the stakes, also the trade-offs sometimes. But the mainstreaming is about building virtuous circle and avoiding vicious ones. So thank you so much, and I will right now turn to Chantal and then allow for a round of questions.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here today. So I'm head of the results team at the OECD in DCD. The objective of my unit is really to strengthen the focus on the results in development cooperation. So for ministries to be more effective and to boost the impact of their programs on sustainable development. Just before, talking about the topic, I'd like to say that we support a community of practice, the OECD DAC Results Community, which is a platform to discuss common challenges, to drive collective learning, share good practices, and at the end to produce guidance. Our members are bilateral and multilateral organizations who are open to all bilateral ministries. So if you want to join, please let us know. It would be a pleasure to have you on board. So I will talk now about how to measure results achieved on transversal priorities. And I will say that I will be focusing on development cooperation. Ernesto was just addressing the whole of government approach to sustainable development, but now I am focusing on development cooperation. There are 2 elements that are important in this title. First of all, how to measure results, why is measuring results important, on what measuring results involves, and I will talk about this. On the second aspect, obviously, is transversal priorities. And I will talk about how to mainstream cross-cutting issues in development cooperation, on how to measure results of transversal priorities. And I think this is very relevant for two reasons, because as Ernesto said, there is this interconnectedness of the SDGs that really calls to stop working in sector silos. But of course, we need to be aware of the transboundary effects, and to look at the, positive or negative effects one project can have on another sector. For instance, health and education are closely related, but also both of them depends on access to electricity. So looking at transversal priorities is very relevant to achieve the SDGs. And we also know that monitoring results on cross-cutting issues is a major area for improvement for many DAC members. So I think that having this seminar today is very much welcome also for this reason. So we'll turn to the next slide. So why is a focus on results important? And first of all, what do we mean by managing for development results, or by RBM, results-based management? This is a strategic management tool that helps development organizations, ministries, to navigate the complexities of development so that they can reach their expected results, and that they can maximize the impact of their individual, but also of the collective efforts. RBM is like a compass. You know where you want to go. You have clear objectives, clear indicators to measure your progress on whatever the obstacles you have to address on your way. You always keep sight of your overarching on long-term objectives. Why do we measure results in development cooperation? There are four purposes. Traditionally, the focus was on accountability and communication. You need to be accountable to your stakeholders, to the public, to the political, sphere, because they are the ones who are, voting the budget. You need also to communicate about your development program, to have, the public support. This is very important. But it is also very important to use results information for decision-making or learning, It's very essential to use this information to make the right strategic decision about how you will allocate your funding. It's also very important to overlooking only at the short-term, easy to achieve and visible results, but to look at providing longer-term impact, on the institutional behavior change that is needed. So it's also very important to look at how to learn, from the data that you are collecting from your results-based management systems, data to learn that what is working and what is not working. So four purposes that are interrelated, but that are very important. I will turn to the next slide now. So, my colleague Ernesto Morales presented on policy coherence for development, so how to ensure coherence at the policy level, which is crucial. And you will hear later today about specific areas that cut across different sectors, such as gender equality, climate action, and digitalization. The purpose of my presentation is to give you insights on the broader results framework that applies to any dimension, whether a sector or a transversal issues. So the slide that you have here shows a wheel that represents a program or project cycle, but it applies also even to a strategy, or to a policy. And it shows that to be able to measure results, you need to have a focus on results at each stage of a strategy, at each stage of a program cycle. It's not just when you develop the logical framework of a project, not just at the end when you evaluate. You need to have this focus on results from the beginning. So the wheel represents the articulation between the 5 steps of a program cycle. And it shows what is needed at each stage to be able to measure results and to use the information you get through this measurement to improve impact or to achieve your objectives. At the strategic planning level, number one, the blue area, you have to decide on your goals and objectives. And it's very important at this stage to set clear targets on indicators. So what we call the results framework that is attached to your strategic plan or to your project or to your program. Then you have to allocate funds, so to look at your budget, and you need to ensure that the fundings you allocate is done according to the set priorities. That's very important as well. Then you turn to the third step, which is about implementing the program. And there you need to have a monitoring system that is in place to collect the data to see how things are going, on whether there is a need to adapt the information to reach your objectives. Sometimes the situation can evolve, so you need to tailor your program to each context, but also to adapt, the activity so that you can reach your expected results. And then you turn to evaluation, and you have to look at, was the program relevant? Was it coherent? Was it effective, efficient? On what was the impact, on whether this impact is sustainable. And at the end, you have to learn and you have to report on the achievement, and you have to have a process to ensure that data is aggregated, that it is analyzed so that it can be used for learning and for future programming. And then you go with the next, strategic planning phase on year 2 of your strategic program. So, it's very important to have this focus on results at each stage of the programming cycle, not just at the end, and not just when we are designing a specific project. I will very quickly show what is the results chain in the next slide. I won't take time to comment on this, but just, this results chain, what we call also the tailwave change, it presents the way in which the inputs that you are providing in a development cooperation program, it can be funding, finance, or technical assistance, for instance, how these inputs translate into activities and then into results, so into outputs that you can attribute to your activities, or into broader outcomes that your activity is contributing to, or into longer term impact. And for each of these, outputs, outcome, and impact, you have to define indicators that you will use to see the progress and to report on the achievement. I won't take long on this, but it's important to have this in mind. So the importance on having indicators at each stage of an activity, At the beginning, it's about, the performance that your performance achievement, the level of the funding that you will be providing, but then at the output, at the outcome, at the impact level. I will turn now on to look at transversal programming, on how to bridge the gap between programming and implementation. So the next slide, please. I am referring here to 12 lessons on mainstreaming cost-cutting issues in development cooperation that were a paper that was issued in 2014 and that draws on the DAC peer reviews. And I think all the lessons that are there are still relevant. And first of all, there are two major findings that come out of the DAC peer reviews that are conducted on a regular basis to assess, the development programs of DAC members. As regards, mainstreaming cost-cutting issues, as Anna just said at the beginning of the day, we can see that many donors take a dual approach when addressing a cost-cutting issue, for instance, environment. They conduct standalone activities, for instance, on biodiversity, in addition to mainstreaming this dimension into their program. And for sure, standalone activities might be needed, but there are no transversal programming. But members maintain these activities as a way to mitigate the risk of becoming invisible, because when you put an issue into the mainstream, it may disappear from sight because everyone then is becoming responsible, but this may means that no one is actually responsible. So by having dedicated activities, you limit this risk. But also, I think this dual approach reflects the fact that most of the donors are still struggling to bridge the gap between policy and implementation. And usually, they focus on doing the easy things, So having, for instance, gender equality into the logical framework of a project, this is needed. But this is not enough, In order to effectively mainstream cost-cutting themes into development cooperation and to measure the results of this, you need action at the different levels. And this action cannot be considered in isolation from one another. This is what this, again, another wheel shows, It shows the 7 interconnected categories where change is needed to have transversal approaches, really mainstream, and to be able to measure their results. So leadership, policy, political guidance, incentives, resources, and learning. So these are the middle of the wheel. And at the external side of the wheel, you can see what is needed in each of these categories. So we'll start with, consistent leadership and sustained commitment. It's when senior management consistently supports the implementation of a cost-cutting policy that you can see this policy being translated into concrete actions at headquarters and at the field level. The second element is that you need to have a policy on a strategic framework for this cost-cutting policy. And this policy should spell out what mainstreaming entails and why it is important for the organization to do this mainstreaming. Then you need to use the cost-cutting policy to engage in a policy and political dialogue at country level with other developing partners and with the government. And this is needed for 3 reasons: to raise the profile of cost-cutting themes with senior officials, to create a common understanding on country-specific issues, the perspectives, the approaches for the effective integration of cost-cutting dimensions into the national planning, and to get the support from the other development partners. And you need this as well to seek out new ways of working together to achieve lasting results. Then you need to have clear implementation guidance with follow-up tools and practices. As I said, there is often a gap between the vision for making mainstreaming a priority in policy and the actual practice. So really, to translate transversal programming into practice, you need to develop implementation guidelines to provide directions on how to implement, how to monitor, on how to understand the outcomes. You need also to put in place systems on incentives on accountability to reward those who are effectively mainstreaming cost-cutting issues. For instance, with specific targets related to transversal priorities that are included into staff objectives or into job description. And finally, you need to allocate sufficient financial and human resources. These resources are often lacking. It's crucial to have well-trained, dedicated specialists with adequate capacity, and you need also to have the appropriate budget and mandate to influence the design and implementation of intervention. And finally, you need to strengthen the culture of learning and mainstreaming, to learn what the good practices are so that you can improve the impact of the program. And I will finish with a last slide on what it means to measure the results of transversal programming, what this means for monitoring, evaluation, and reporting. And I just want to share what 4 good practices are here. So the first point is about including the transversal dimension issue into the intervention design, and to include specific indicators to measure progress against its transversal dimensions, so to have output on outcome indicators. This is required for this dimension to be taken into account in monitoring and evaluation. The second point is that it is very important to systematically integrate mainstreaming into the monitoring systems and into the evaluation work of the ministry. You need to monitor, as part of the usual monitoring, and you need to look at the extent to which the transversal dimension is being addressed when you evaluate a program. The third point is about integrating mainstreaming indicators into the co-reporting processes, within the ministry, to report on the results that are delivered as part of the mandatory reporting process, and to report on the mainstreaming as well. And the fourth point is about improving the collection and dissemination of data related to the cross-cutting themes, to integrate explicitly the cross-cutting issues into program documentation. This is needed to use information for strategic planning and for learning. I just end with two resources that I would like to offer to you. I will continue working on this. Just to mention that we have issued guiding principles, on sustainable development results that you can look at, and we have a website that is available. I can provide a link to this. And just to let you know that we have just released the policy report on achieving SDG results in development cooperation, a summary for policymakers. This report describes 6 strategic actions that would help development cooperation leaders, managers, and policymakers to use the SDGs, to manage the post-COVID-19 transition, towards more sustainable and equitable development. And we have seen the importance of the SDGs to avoid working in silos and really to have transversal approaches. So I think it would be important also for you to look at this. I will stop here, but I will be happy to respond to any questions and to provide, maybe at a later stage of information, or to respond at a later stage to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chantal, and thank you for your availability also to respond to the question. And I see, the one thing I wanted to mention, and yesterday, one of the starting point of the discussion on private sector engagement was that it's a means to an end. I guess the same can be said here. Mainstreaming is always has to be a means to an end. The end has to be measured, and the results have to be measured. So the mainstreaming shouldn't be an end in itself. I think that's also, and the whole result approach allows to provide for that framework. I see that we have a question. That's great. Data, over to you.
Hello, thank you very much for the very interesting and valuable presentations. I wanted to ask, could you tell more on what could be the first steps of such results approach? And perhaps if we still have time, maybe you can elaborate a bit more about the benefits of aligning this results framework to the SDG framework. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a very broad question, which would merit, but yeah, I think the first step in designing a results approach is to develop a results framework, and we have done a lot of work on the merit of aligning this results framework to the SDGs, and there are several dimensions to this. First of all, the SDGs offer a results framework. You have common goals, common targets, common indicators. These have been agreed by the international communities. So the question is, why are development partners and government also in partner countries not using the SDGs as a common results framework, to guide development progress at country level, to have, this collective effort that is needed to implement the SDGs and to reach the goals, And this is important because we can see that there are a lot of data gaps. We can see that there is a proliferation of indicators because the partners are not using the SDG indicators necessarily. They are using their own indicators. Therefore, there is a proliferation of indicators. For instance, we have seen that in the electricity sector, providers of development cooperation in Ethiopia, they are using 40 different indicators to measure just access to electricity. But what happens is that they are not able to measure data against this indicator. And the government is not able to report progress on access to electricity because of this proliferation of indicators. So it makes sense to, use really the relevant indicators and to look first at what is in the SDG framework, what are the SDG indicators. We have looked at these issues. We have seen that there are a series of obstacles that are technical, organizational, and political. Technical, some SDG indicators are still difficult to measure, and we have to take this into account for sure. But a lot of the SDG indicators are now available and can be used. There are organizational issues because it takes time for organization to move, from the MDGs indicators into the SDGs indicators. When you are used to measure, access to education, it's harder to move to another indicator to measure, success in the education sector, for instance. So it takes time, and there are political reasons, when I refer to access to electricity, some donors, they want to focus on renewable energy to green energy. So they would design their very specific indicators. So there are many reasons why there isn't, such a great use of the SDG indicators. But in this report that I just mentioned, we are providing solutions, and we at a political level, and we are also continuing to look at developing an, really an instrumental guidance for all partners at the technical level to make more use of these SDGs.
Thanks very much. I see that we have another question. I think Eluta, do you want to come in?
Yes. I listened to you and everything sounds really perfect and powerful, but then I look at the reality of implementing projects like the one that implements projects, and it's okay to measure and to set all these things and frameworks and see the impact and everything. If it's a long-term project, if it's like for 2-3 years, you can see some kind of you can be more also, you can see the effectiveness of the project and so on. But if the project is for 3 months or 2 months, it's quite challenging to put all this effort, and then you can't see the same impact or of the project in such a short time. So how to deal with this and how to still use this framework, but it's like 2-3 months project and with low, not so much financial resources.
That's a very good question. I can respond to this. This is a fair point, but I think your project, even if it's short term, you have to look at it into the broader program, into the broader activities that are done, that are conducted by the Ministry of Latvia in a specific country. And you have to see how this, single project, fits within the overall activities conducted at country level, on how the results of these specific projects will contribute to the results of the activities, conducted by Latvia in a specific country. And then, so obviously your project will not contribute directly to long-term, achievements, but it will contribute to your program. On your program, as maybe longer term outputs and outcomes, So the outputs of your activity will contribute to outcome of what is done by Latvia in a specific country. And this is where the, the results framework can be done at the level of each country, in which you operate. And then into this results framework, you can have every single activities that is reflected, because it will contribute to the results achieved and shown in this results framework.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Chantal. And I think pointing to indeed how this project or this piece of the puzzle fits in the wider puzzle, and that's also make in a way the link with policy coherence, that if everything is cut around and there is not a common picture, then it's probably harder to demonstrate also the results that you have achieved through all of the single projects. We are unfortunately running out of time and already running a bit late. But really, I want to thank you, Chantal, and to thank you, Ernesto, for your time today and for setting the scene. I think it was really important to have that initial discussion, which will allow us, in a way, to deep dive into the specific areas, but to not forget, in a way, the general framework and also the more general considerations around policy coherence and embedding that into a results framework. So thank you so much for your time.